The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague.
Welcome to the Books Podcast. I'm Tim Hague. First, a quick mention of an upcoming event. For those of our listeners who live in or around London, we'll be recording an episode of the Books Podcast in front of an audience at the Owl Bookshop in Kentish Town on the 17th of June. We're talking to the great Philip Norman about Mr. Moonlight, his brilliant new biography of Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager. Tickets from Owl Bookshop's website. We'd love to see you. For this episode, we're peering into the abyss, a watery abyss. It's an alarm call of a book with the apocalyptic title of The Surge, the race against the most destructive force in nature. And it's one of those books you sort of want to press into people's hands and say, read this, it's fascinating. Not to mention terrifying.
The storm surge is the most destructive kind of flood. The word meadow means a piece of land which gets flooded regularly and produces the best hay. Often people discover there's a flood risk after they've been flooded and after the value of their property has been affected.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Jeevan Vasagar, thank you for joining us on Books Podcast.
Hi Tim, great to be here.
Well, perhaps we'd better start off with an explanation of the title, the surge, a storm surge. We're not just talking bad weather, are we?
So absolutely not, Tim. I mean, the idea behind the title is there are lots of different kinds of floods. There are floods that come from the air with rainwater. There are floods that come from rivers. The storm surge is the most destructive kind of flood. It's when seawater is whipped onto the land by a fierce storm wind. It's a combination of wind and low pressure, but mainly the wind, pushing a huge volume of seawater onto the land. And people who've experienced it and lived to tell the tale talk about the sea coming to their homes, basically. It's as if they're in the middle of a washing machine. Exactly, yeah, exactly. And they just say it's incredible. It's an incredible sight. You just see waves rolling across the farmland where your dad had planted his potatoes or whatever it happened to be. And it's the biggest amount of water, the greatest volume, moving across the biggest area with the greatest destructive potential. So for listeners old enough to remember, Hurricane Katrina, which devastated New Orleans, was a storm surge.
And did like $200 billion of damage, I learned from the book. Now, you start off by describing in a sort of a detailed and novelistic way a particular surge event in 1953. Now, the reason I want to go back to this and look at it in some detail is that I've never heard of it. Now, obviously, it was before my time, but we've heard of other sort of apocalyptic events that happen, in history, especially in the 20th century. And the extremely cold winter of 1946 and then 1962, 3, I think. So there are folk memories of these things, but this particular flood completely passed me by, and yet, well, you go do human stories and detailed account of it. Can you tell us about it, because it's news to me?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we'll come back to this maybe, but the fact that it was forgotten, the fact that it's been erased from the historical memory, is one reason why I was interested in it. So, this is early in the year in 1953. An enormous storm surge hits the North Sea coast of Britain. So all along, basically, the eastern coast of England, huge quantities of water are pushed inland. The surge keeps going all the way down the North Sea and hits the Netherlands, where it's even more destructive. So hundreds of people die in England, and many more people, nearly 2,000 people, die in the Netherlands. It's catastrophic, and it's recognised at the time as a huge shock. This is... Both of these countries, Britain and the Netherlands, are pretty modern countries, pretty developed, pretty wealthy countries. Britain had just won the Second World War, regarded itself as a one of the world's great powers, and here it was, defenceless against its ancient enemy, the sea. The Netherlands,
in particular,
yeah.
was famous for its anti-sea engineering, its ability to resist these things.
Absolutely.
And yet, a couple of thousand dead and utter devastation.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about both countries, because what happened in the UK, in England, was eye-watering, and we're still, of course, living with the implications of it.
Absolutely. So one of the reasons I was interested in this flood was that it was really consequential. So out of this, some time after this, Britain has the idea of building a barrier across the Thames, because when a storm surge happens, water is forced onto the land and up a river, and there's a threat that it's forced all the way up the Thames and into the heart of London, potentially devastating the capital. So there is this idea of building the Thames barrier, and that comes to fruition. The Dutch also say we must protect ourselves against the sea, we must fortify ourselves. So from this flood comes the idea of, what protection do we need? So it's really consequential. But just to go back to your question of why we don't remember it, why we don't talk about it, I don't really know. But my theory is that it's because it happens just after the Second World War. People have been through enormous amounts of suffering, don't want to recollect this other period of suffering in which they don't really emerge very well. So Britain can tell itself a story of victory after the Second World War, can tell itself a story of emerging, perhaps not stronger, but certainly emerging on the right side. This is a story of defeat.
Oh, you tell us that there was no national warning system in Britain for such a thing, which, looking back, seems crazy. Did people realise this sort of thing was wont to happen?
People knew about the destructive consequences of floods and had been warning about the destructive consequences of floods for some time, particularly in the Netherlands. And there's a man who perhaps we'll come to a bit later in this discussion, a man called Johan van Veen, a Dutch engineer who had been consistently warning for a long time that the flood defences in the Netherlands weren't strong enough. It was entirely possible this would happen. We just weren't prepared for it. And this is one of the themes of my book, really. These are often avoidable disasters. So
I want to do a little bit more. You've mentioned the kind of numbers who died, but the amount of destruction and the amount of land that was destroyed. Let's talk about Canvey Island, which is in Essex. It's just on the outskirts of London there, or probably beyond the outskirts of London, but it's quite significant because I'm going to ask you in a minute what the response was to this. What happened to Canvey Island?
So Canvey Island, for those who don't know, is pretty much right at the southern tip of Essex, is the point where the Thames empties out into the North Sea, and the entire town was basically completely inundated by the surge in 1953. And this is on low-lying land, so the entire town has to be evacuated. Thousands of people have to make their way out of the town. And for those of you who know the place or have been there, it's an island with basically kind of one sort of slender connection to the mainland. So there were thousands of people making their way on foot across this connection to the mainland. And, significant loss of life there. One of the reasons there's significant loss of life is that it happens late at night. And this goes back to the point that you made about warning. The flood hits kind of much earlier in the day, strikes all along the East Coast.
Starting in Yorkshire.
It's
the whole of the East Coast of England.
Starting at Spurn Point in Yorkshire, and people are aware that something is going badly wrong, but in each of these places, each of the towns it hits, the response is entirely regional, entirely local. It happens at the weekend. There is speculation that, this is when cabinet ministers are away at their country houses, and so there isn't an organised government response. But certainly by today's standards, it's incredibly slow. The response is incredibly slow. The military do get involved. Engineers do go out and look at the sea defences. But by the time they go out and look at the defences, they realise it's too late. The defences have been obliterated, and the priority is getting people to safety.
We mentioned Holland. Now, Holland is, the Netherlands, which is, I said, is famous for dealing with this. And they have hundreds of years of saying, we will make sense of the sea. We will reclaim land from the sea. In fact, there's a lovely quote that somebody said, God created the world, but the Dutch made the Netherlands. Well, I want to ask, was that a quixotic enterprise? Was that asking for trouble? Because what happened, we can discuss a little what happened in the Netherlands as well.
Well, the Dutch have always prided themselves on being masters of water. And through Dutch history, what has happened is that each of their attempts to sort of master the sea have become bigger with time. So they've put more money, better technology, going from pumping out the water with windmills to using fossil fuel power to push the sea away, better and better engineering. But at this point, after the Second World War, the Dutch sea defences are really neglected. Now, they haven't been high enough before the war, but a key thing to remember is that the Dutch had been occupied by the Germans during the Second World War.
And the Germans wouldn't let the engineers to the sea.
The Germans wouldn't let the engineers get to the coast. So the Dutch engineers, who were responsible for maintaining the defences, couldn't get to the coast. But it's worse than that, because the Wehrmacht dug into the Dutch sea defences. They put machine gun nests in there. They used them as part of their defence of the Reich. And that obviously weakened the defences. So and all of the sort of normal maintenance, so rabbit holes, mole holes, which are normally getting fixed by people, aren't being fixed. So the Dutch coastal defences are in a really weakened state at this point in their history. The other thing to bear in mind is that a lot of the Dutch experts have been forced to go and support the Nazi war effort. So they've been taken off as conscripted labour. The Dutch supplies of iron that are used to build sea fortifications, they've been taken by the Germans as well. So the Dutch are in a really weakened state, not entirely through their own fault.
So what is the response? How do we're going to go around the rest of the world a little bit later on, but let's stick with the UK and Holland. How do they respond to the 1953 events? And you've already touched on it because we've got Canvey Island and the Thames Barrier. Let us focus on that interesting arrangement.
Yeah, so pretty early on when this happened, it is recognised that there is a risk to London. There is a threat to the capital. And I think on both sides of the North Sea, there's an understanding that something like this mustn't be allowed to happen again. But what actually happens, certainly on the British side, is something that happens often after a catastrophe. After the immediate shock of a flood, there's a sort of period of stasis, and people aren't really clear about what's needed. People have some sense of what's needed, but it costs a lot of money, it's a lot of effort. So there's a sort of period of delay before anything really happens. And the thing that kicks things into a higher gear is that there's another flood up the Thames, which comes very close to affecting the Houses of Parliament. And at this point...
And this is 1965.
Exactly.
Yes, so
exactly.
Just 10 years later or so.
Yeah.
And yes, again, you describe in the book, it's like a few centimetres away from coming onto the terrace and flooding the Houses of Parliament.
Yeah.
Tom Dryburgh's there, presumably having a quick fag. Oh, no, you could smoke in the House of Parliament. But anyway, he's there, and he goes and he alerts the chamber.
Exactly.
I mean,
so during a debate, as you say, Dryburgh comes in and says, you should be aware that, floodwaters are kind of lapping the Palace of Westminster. So this catalyses the sort of government response. And there's a man called Herman Bondi, who's a brilliant mind, great scientist, who applies himself to the question of floods. And he really knows nothing about floods, nothing about engineering. He's a cosmologist, so his study is the study of the planets. But he just applies himself to this problem and says, the answer is to build
I should say we have company on this one. We're recording at Jeevan's house, and some of Jeevan's family are joining in.
That's my dog, Coco, who's making our podcasting debut. So there's as I say, there's a man called Herman Bondi who basically cuts through the muddle and says what we need is a barrier across the Thames. So, and there are some commercial issues around this. So at this point in the 50s and 60s, there's a sort of late heyday of the Port of London. It's the most important port in the world. It's kind of rapidly waning. It's going to be eclipsed by New York. It's going to be eclipsed by Rotterdam and the Asian ports very, very soon. But at this point, it's still an incredibly busy port. And so the Port of London has resisted this for a long time, the idea of a barrier across the Thames. But Bondi just cuts through, and he cuts through in a way that I think, looking at it now, is a little bit odd. He's basically kind of incredibly elitist about it. He says, if Canvey Island is destroyed, well, that's that. That's regrettable, but that's that. If London is paralysed, if the London Underground is not knocked out of action, then the whole of Britain is affected, and therefore we must protect the capital.
Well, our listeners around the country will go, yes, we've heard that sort of thing before, and I think they've got a point. But of course, this raises a very big issue. The engineering to do these projects is colossal. The costs are eye-watering. In principle, I suppose, there's no engineering reason that you couldn't protect Canvey Island, but if it's going to cost £100 billion, you go, well, cost-benefit analysis. And that's a theme that's going to come back into the discussion again later on, because that is the point, isn't it? Where you put your resources, because these are unbelievable the engineering is just breathtaking.
So actually, this is really germane, Tim, and really timely, because last year the Environment Agency went back and strengthened some of the sea defences around Canvey Island, which are already kind of incredibly strong, where they strengthened them further, spent about £75 million. And I was there on the island when this was happening. And one of the people there said, look, you could just give us a few £100,000 each and we'll all leave. just bribe us and we'll go.
I mean, on that on that theme, though, there's a Dutch engineer, I didn't write his name down, but who proposed a scheme to turn the North Sea into a lake with like a 500-kilometre dam from Scotland across to Norway, and then a similar one between England and France, presumably so that Holland wouldn't be... which, I mean, I sort of want to say, is that theoretically, technologically possible?
It appears to be technically feasible. The idea of turning the North Sea into a sort of freshwater lake. It would have enormous costs, and it would have significant engineering complexity. But I think the real reason why it wouldn't happen is it would require extensive cooperation, not just between Britain and the Netherlands, but between Britain and a number of other countries that all have an interest in the North Sea. And I think that would make it quite difficult to pull off.
Oh, I think politically it'd be utterly impossible. And it would be like putting a man on the moon in terms of money. But no, it's interesting to think that you could, in principle, do it. I mean, the ambition of these engineers is really inspiring. It brings those, though, to one of the themes of the book that I was most interested in, which is a question of where people settle, where they decide to live. At the moment, we've still got, and this is what really impresses you. We've still got worldwide construction of homes in flood-prone areas. At the moment, I pull a statistic out of your book: 230 million people live 1 metre above high tide in the world. That's asking for trouble, isn't it?
So one really important thing to remember, and it's kind of a thing that always startles people when I say it, is that water can be death, but water is always life as well. So floods bring ruin, but in the past, floods have also brought prosperity. Not storm surges from the sea, that's just salt water sweeping onto the land, it's just destructive. But a river flood brings seeds down the river, brings silt, fish spawn in the land afterwards. It is a life-giving force. It is natural for us to want to live by water. If you live by the sea, you have access to trade, you have fish. If you live by a river, again, you have trade. It's good for agriculture. The word meadow means a piece of land which gets flooded regularly and produces the best hay. And you export that hay and you make money out of it. So our ancestors in the past us still today, we all depend on water to a lesser and greater extent. What's happened over time is that we've become more and more reliant on technology to hold back the water, and that's had a bit of a perverse consequence. So if, we mentioned a minute ago, all of these folks on Canvey Island, £75 million spent last year to protect them, you can spend more and more and more money protecting people who live by the coast, but the consequence of that is that people end up living there and don't understand the danger they're in.
I sort of feel a proverb coming on: he who lives by the coast dies by the coast. No, that can't be true, but you know what I mean.
Well, I think you're spot on, Tim. I mean, if you think of like the great sort of hazards, to humanity, famines, fires, viruses, all of these sorts of things. The one thing we can't live without is water. I mean, there are cultures where people live at the top of hills and live up mountains, but that makes their lives very difficult because they've got to go down to the river to get access to it. We cluster around water for a reason. It's essential to us. And
yet we have that flood in Pakistan a few years ago, which inundated, was it 10% of the country? That's
right.
You've got Tuvalu, the little island in the Pacific, which is essentially now unlivable, and they've all had to migrate to Australia. Are we not sort of making a rod for our own back by doing these things? Because whenever you protect an area and build the dikes higher and stronger and things, when they're overwhelmed, it's even more devastating.
That's right. Yeah. So Pakistan that you mentioned just there is a really, really interesting example because this relates to the kind of colonial history of water management. So Pakistan, as you know, was part of the British Raj, part of the British-dominated Indian subcontinent, and it was the British who took on a massive project to basically bring the Indus under control, use it for irrigation, and this was both good and bad. So it had, before the British irrigation scheme, which is still today the biggest irrigation scheme anywhere in the world, the Indus was much more of a kind of wandering vagabond river, which would go here and there, and it would bring prosperity to the places it went to, and then shift away from other places. But it was a sort of shallow, winding river, or kind of multiplicity of rivers. And when it flooded, the floods would be shallow, spread over a wide area, will be much less damaging. And, the British-built scheme has resulted in much more damaging floods. It's not just the British alone. That's an important point. So it's also, the Pakistani government is now sort of handling, managing the river and their responsibility as well for the floods there, for reasons that we can come to in a minute. But I think what's interesting about this is that through the last 300 to 400 years, we've done these successive projects to extract more money, basically, from floodplains, which is by building more houses there,
But also to
having more
settle more
farmland
people.
there.
There are too many people, aren't there?
Absolutely. Well, I hesitate to say that there are too many people because the question is always which people are too many exactly. But I think there is a risk of there's a heightened risk when there are very large numbers of people living in floodplains without adequate protection. And we as a society need to have a conversation about where do those people live, how do they get away when there's danger, how are they protected against risk, how are they insured?
That's right. We have a desperate shortage of housing, and yet, one of the examples in the book, there's just a paragraph about the town of Blythe. There was a housing project in Blythe, which is prone to flooding, this is something else we're going to go on to because it was flooded twice in a year or something. New builds, and people had bought their house there, and then they can't get insurance. Well, I want to talk about that in some more detail. But is that not a kind of mis-selling? If a builder builds on a floodplain and doesn't make the provision against the flood devastation, I'd want to sue him.
That's a really interesting question, and I think part of the problem here is that we're not having a completely honest and open conversation about the risks of flooding. So often people discover there's a flood risk after they've been flooded and after the value of their property has been affected. So what you were touching on here, Tim, is there's basically an agreement between insurers and the government called Flood Re, which is about how we manage our flood risk and how we manage the risk to properties. And part of the understanding of Flood Re is that it's eventually phased out and that we shift to a situation where houses are more flood resilient and we discourage construction in the most flood-prone areas. That's why it doesn't cover new build houses like the ones you just mentioned in Blythe. The problem is that often people going into these areas don't know. The builders, for natural commercial reasons, just build the houses and, try and sell them. That's what they're incentivized to do. So
that's
no
capitalism, though. That's capitalism.
Absolutely.
They
And the people
ought
who
to be obliged to build flood-resistant houses.
Well, the people who end up carrying the can then are these poor householders
Yes.
who, go into it without knowing the risks.
Well, that takes us to the United States because you detail in the book that America has had this issue. They had a different scheme, but again, insurers were withdrawing from being prepared to insure against floods. The government sets up an insurance scheme that's going to be backed and so that everybody can get insurance. And by now we find, I learn, that that insurance scheme is essentially bankrupt, and they've had to start behaving like a regular insurer. It hasn't worked. So you're right. The question is, where should the risk? Who should bear the risk?
Yeah, and I think, and this obviously affects different classes differently. And one of the things that struck me as really interesting when I was doing the research for this book is that the first people to leave a place that gets flooded regularly are the poor. They're the most mobile. They have the most to lose from being flooded, but also simply decide we're gonna pack up. We're gonna go somewhere else. And then the people who don't move are the super rich, who just say, well, Florida suits me perfectly fine. I can rebuild if my house gets flooded. I'm not worried about insurance. And the people who are stuck in the middle are those with most of their wealth in property who can't afford the risk of a catastrophe. So if they get, it's often the middle class who in some ways are the least mobile, the most stuck in place.
But that when we're in America now, Florida is clearly at risk because it's quite low and there are a lot of very rich people there. New York City is at serious risk of flooding. Another quote from your book is the consequences of building valuable property at high risk affect, more than the super rich. They can usually manage, or they just move if they have to. But the last time the US housing market stumbled, the global financial system went with it. This is an international, it's a worldwide crisis when we're not addressing this, when we're not facing these facts.
Absolutely. So property is really the primary channel that people use to transfer wealth to the next generation. And I think, there is a risk of some people it being in for a really big shock if they find that the asset they think is worth £500,000 or £250,000 is actually worth £150,000 because of flood risk, and people haven't factored this in.
So, again, you suggest that by 2039, the calculation is that 2 million British homes won't be able to access insurance, not to mention the mortgages if somebody wants to buy them. I don't know where we go from there. In a way, I suppose I'm asking, do you have any answers?
I think that this is a question that we need to have a conversation about. Basically, I think that people haven't fully woken up to it, and the people who have woken up to it are those who've been flooded, are those who've seen their insurance premium spike or haven't been able to get flood insurance in some cases. But we as a country haven't engaged with the problem. I think that when we do, there'll be a clamour for the government to do more, basically, for more government protection.
Isn't the problem, though, that state-backed insurance disincentivises the builders?
Absolutely,
because they're no longer the ones carrying the risk.
Absolutely. So what should happen is that government and business work together to help us modify our behaviour, to encourage us to live in different places, to build in different places, to build in ways that are more flood resilient. I'm kind of afraid, given the sort of current state of British politics, that kind of joined up thinking isn't going to happen anytime soon. Partly because it's quite a shocking message to deliver, particularly in cases where people have just been flooded. If you go to a community that's recently been flooded and say, look, you live in an incredibly high-risk area, there are only, 50 or 30 houses here, really the thing for you to do is leave. You can imagine the kind of reception a politician is going to get in that circumstance. So what happens is the politicians go to those places and say, don't worry, we will rebuild. Your lives will continue just as they were before. Unfortunately, we're not in a situation, partly because of climate change, where our lives are going to continue in just the same way.
I find, although we've been talking in these extreme terms about these terrible problems, which are only going to get worse, I find your book weirdly optimistic, because you do see some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. Talk to me a little bit about the way the Dutch want to give more room back to the rivers and other ways that we might address the...
So one of the central ideas in my book is that we've had this long relationship with nature where in the past our ancestors have been more adaptive, have learned to live with it. If you take the case of the Dutch, a farmer would have a boat tied up, and that boat would be very useful to take his cows to market, and the boat would also be very useful for his own escape in case his land got flooded. And what's happened in the middle of the 20th century, and particularly around the surge in 1953, is that our response has become incredibly militaristic. So we've basically focused on kind of concrete and steel, on seawalls, on flood defense barriers. And there's a moment now in history over the last few decades where there's been a sort of shift back again. So the Dutch are a case in point. So they have allowed... So what we did to our rivers basically over the last few centuries is engineered them, make them straighter, make them deeper.
And dam them, of course.
Dam them, make them flow faster.
There's a lovely quote in the book that the dams, the sort of favoured mega project for dictators and one-party states.
Absolutely.
Has been for about 100 years.
The idea of subjugating nature is really, really powerful. But not just in dictatorship. So if you're in London and you walk down to the Thames, there are very few places where you can get down to the Thames and sort of dip your feet in the water, push a rowing boat out, put a fishing rod in the river, which are all things that Londoners have done for centuries in the past. So now if you go down to the Thames, especially in the centre of London, the most likely thing you'll encounter is a huge embankment, so a massive, massive defence against the river. So you can see the river, but you can't engage with it. And what the Dutch did, which was really interesting, was try and reshape their rivers, even in the middle of cities, try and make them flow in a way that was broader, wider. So when the rivers filled up with water, when there was a flood, there was land on which the river could expand, so they weren't building right up to the edge of the water. And they did this in a city called Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And what they found was that people actually loved it. So loads of swimmers go down to this spot in Nijmegen where the river's opened up, and people go jogging there, and they walk their dogs there, and suddenly the city has gone from turning away from the river or just looking at it from a distance to properly engaging with it.
Oh, yeah, well, I'll tell you what then, Jeevan. Talk to me about the philosophy of our relationship with nature.
So one thing that I found really interesting when I was writing the book is that there isn't really a kind of fixed view of how humanity relates to nature, and this has shifted around quite a lot over time. So there is an understanding in every kind of human tradition, kind of East and West, that we're sort of part of nature, that we coexist with it, that we're in some ways symbiotic with it. And there's also a view that we're the superior beings, we're here to dominate nature. And one thing that I found really interesting was when I looked at the clearing of the fens, of the draining of the fens in East Anglia, which is this sort of big, kind of almost a colonial project that happened within the country. So an elite, basically from the southeast, coming to East Anglia and saying, we're going to change the landscape here, no matter what the people who lived there thought.
We're going back like hundreds of years.
We are.
400, 500, 600 years.
Yeah, so like the period just before and after the English Civil War. So we're talking about kind of King Charles and the parliamentary regime after the Civil War. And there was a group of, we would call them today venture capitalists, but they called themselves gentlemen adventurers or something like that.
Yeah.
And they basically got involved in draining the fens, much to the displeasure of the people who lived there and who quite enjoyed the fens as they were. But it was interesting that they also had kind of propaganda. So they had people writing for them and saying, this is an example, this is in the tradition of the Roman aqueducts and the hanging gardens of Babylon. Man is put on the earth to reshape what God has made. This isn't a peerless creation that can't be improved upon. It's something that man is there to improve.
When you were talking about the Thames Barrier in the book, you say it was one of those sort of mad adventures, one of those insane engineering projects, like putting a tunnel under the English Channel. And yes, you're right.
Yes.
The human race likes putting a man on the moon.
We like an engineering challenge.
I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
These are mad, again, quixotic enterprises. And
Yes.
yet the human race really does like to look at something and go, I could change that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Which is exactly what happens with East Anglia. Someone looks at a marsh and says, we don't want a marsh, we want a field of wheat. And to create a field of wheat, you need this enormous kind of amount of money and labour.
But as though marshes are not any use to anybody. They don't, as though they don't support wildlife and peat and things. And you have a brilliant description of how when you dry out a peat bog, you've changed things to its disadvantage, which you're now going to describe to me.
Exactly. So the peat basically, so the peat exists in kind of in the watery state that it exists in. It's a sort of almost a sort of living organism, kind of slowly decomposing kind of plant material from decades, centuries ago. But when you dry it out, when it's exposed to oxygen, the whole thing just subsides basically. So the fens end up, as we know now, kind of below sea level and needing to be sort of pumped out constantly.
And also all the carbon dioxide comes out of it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a carbon bomb as well. But it is kind of really interesting to me that people basically look at these landscapes, these natural landscapes, and at the time, in the sort of 17th century parlance, described them as a waste or a wilderness. So this is no use to anybody. Therefore, it's a waste, and we must get rid of it. And the same language that's used in East Anglia is then used in North America. So the Native Americans are wasting the American landscape.
Back to capitalism. It's a waste of a resource
away
if
from
it's
the
not
river
making a
or
profit for somebody.
At it from a distance.
That's the
properly engaging with
definition.
it.
Are you optimistic? Do you think that this is one of those natural circumstances, one of those natural things that we will be able to come to terms with, or is it just going to kill us all?
So there is a lot of bad news. So sea levels are going to rise sort of inexorably.
You've got a chapter about that, the melting of the Antarctic ice. Yeah.
Absolutely, that is just going to happen. Storms are going to become more intense, and they're going to intensify more rapidly, and they're going to dump more rain on us. So, we're going to live on a hotter planet that is going to be more difficult for us to live with. But the thing that struck me when I spoke to, in that particular chapter that you mentioned, when I spoke to the scientists about it, they weren't gloomy at all. They just said, we are an adaptive species, we're a technological species, we're clever, we're organized, we will figure out ways of responding to this. Of course, this isn't, the ideal situation to find ourselves in, but it is where we find ourselves, and, we are going to find a way of engaging with this. And I'm reasonably confident in humanity that we will do that. I think the thing that makes me uncomfortable or anxious is that this will obviously be unequal according to where you live. It'll be unequal according to how much money you have. So some people will be more exposed than others. And this is a bit of a grim part of the future that we're heading into very rapidly.
Well, I hope that you're right more than I am about this. That is The Surge, The Race Against the Most Destructive Force in Nature by Jeevan Vasagar, published by Mudlark at £22. Next time on Books Podcast, we'll be discussing Marilyn Monroe's reading habits. Oh, yeah. Oh, you're looking forward to that. Jeevan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Pleasure.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.
That was really, really good fun. I'm so sorry about her. She seems to have got more excited as things have gone on.
Well,
so.
she realises that the books...
She recognises the urgency of the situation
Yes,
more than I do.
that must be it.